The Battle of Tel El Kebir, fought on the morning of the 13th of September 1882, was the final decisive action in the Anglo-Egyptian War. It was fought about 65 miles northeast of Cairo on the railway line between the capital and the Suez Canal. A British army under General Sir Garnet Wolseley, having successfully conducted a nighttime advance, launched a surprise attack on the impressive Egyptian fortifications. A bayonet charge by the Highland Brigade, complete with swirling bagpipes, breached the defences, and within an hour the Egyptian army had been routed. It signalled the end of the nationalist rising by Ahmed Urabi and the beginning of a British military presence in Egypt that would last for the next 70 years, concluding with the Suez Crisis in 1956.
In a previous video about the Bombardment of Alexandria at the beginning of this war, I explained why Urabi Pasha had rebelled and why the British got involved in Egypt. So if you want to find out that backstory, then there's a link appearing about now, and there's one in the description below. But fundamentally,
the British saw Arabi's rebellion as a threat to their ownership and use of the Suez Canal, a vital communication route to her empire in Asia, especially the jewel in the imperial crown, India. The British sent a fleet of Royal Navy ironclad warships to the Egyptian port of Alexandria to safeguard their interests. This resulted in nationalist riots in the city in which European nationals were killed and their property destroyed. And in response to these riots and Urabi fortifying gun emplacements facing the Royal Navy, British Naval Commander Admiral Seymour issued an ultimatum to the Egyptians to stand down, which, when ignored, led to a 2-day bombardment by the British warships. Whilst the British now controlled Alexandria, Urabi still controlled the rest of Egypt and threatened to block the Suez Canal. The British government, under Prime Minister William Gladstone, decided to send an expeditionary force to Egypt to remove the nationalist threat and to reinstall the acquiescent Khedive, Tewfik Pasha, who had effectively been sidelined by Arabi Pasha and his Egyptian Army Rebellion. The British expeditionary force would consist of nearly 20,000 British regular soldiers and some 7,000 soldiers from Britain's Indian Army, all under the command of the preeminent Victorian General, Sir Garnet Wolseley. Wolseley's strategy was to defeat Urabi in a decisive battle, then capture Cairo, and to restore the Khedive to power, power under some sort of British control. He had two potential lines of advance. The first was to follow the railway line south, the 130 miles from Alexandria to Cairo. The second, more risky one, was to enter the Suez Canal and then launch an attack on Cairo from the northeast. This option relied on Urabi and his nationalist army not blocking the canal in the first place. On the 5th of August, a small force under Major General Sir Archibald Allison ventured south from Alexandria on an armoured train. They'd only travelled 20 miles when they encountered substantial defences blocking the route at Kaf el-Dawa. When Allison conveyed this news to Wolseley, the commander decided to go for his second option, an attack from the Suez Canal.
the problem with this plan was that Urabi Pasha was all too aware that Wolseley only had two really viable options open to him. He had blocked one route, and all he needed to do was ruin option 2 by blocking the Suez Canal as well. And if he had done so, it could have changed everything.
Sometimes leaders need to follow their gut instinct rather than seeking advice. It was to Arabi's loss and Wolseley's gain that the Egyptian leader sought advice. Advice from the chairman of the Suez Canal Company, Ferdinand de Lesseps. The canal had been de Lesseps' brainchild, and he had chaired the company even before the first pick and shovel had been driven into the desert sands. The Frenchman assured Urabi Pasha that the British would never conduct a campaign involving the canal for fear of actually damaging it and putting their communication lines to the Asia at risk. With those reassuring words ringing in his ears, Urabi left the canal alone. It was his greatest strategic and military blunder. Wolseley's army entered the canal from both directions, the British regulars coming from the Mediterranean, the Indian army coming from the Red Sea via Aden. And on the 20th of August, they landed and occupied Ismailia, roughly at the midpoint of the canal, about 70 miles from Cairo.
Urabi Pasha now hurriedly concentrated his forces outside the village of Tel El Kebir, astride the railway and the freshwater canal that connected Cairo to the Suez Canal where Wolseley had landed. Not only had Wolseley caught the Egyptians off guard, but he had halved the distance that his army would have to march to capture Cairo, compared to the Alexandria option. And he had the benefit of marching alongside the freshwater canal for the whole length of his journey through the Egyptian desert. On the 28th of August, the Egyptians attacked the British vanguard as they advanced towards the Kassassin lock on the freshwater canal. The attack came as a complete surprise to the two British infantry battalions, who were actually in danger of losing until Major General Graham requested support from the cavalry, who were camped about 4 miles away.
What happened next was one of the great cavalry charges of British military history. The cavalry, consisting of those elite units of the Life Guards, the Royal Horse Guards and the 7th Dragoon Guards, arrived just as night was drawing in. In what became known as the Moonlight Charge, they swept through the Egyptian forces, cutting down their enemies. The Egyptians, who had been looking at a potential victory only minutes beforehand, were now forced into a terrifying retreat for 5 miles, with the British cavalry constantly appearing out of the darkness to assault them. Shortly after the Moonlight Charge, the British got another piece of good fortune when they captured the Egyptian army's chief military engineer, General Mahmoud Fahmy. Incredibly, it seems that the general had gone for a walk in the desert with a small bodyguard and had been surprised by a British cavalry unit. Urabi Pasha now had to prepare his defences outside Tel El Kebir without his main engineer. Having said that, the work that General Fahmy had already overseen was impressive. Stretching away at right angles from the Cairo to Ismailia railway and the adjacent canal was a massive sand and gravel embankment on top of a plateau which was 120 feet high. In front of this huge earthwork was a ditch, 10 feet wide, 5 feet deep. Towards the southern or railway end of the Egyptian lines, they had constructed a series of redoubts with artillery in them. Behind the embankment was a series of trenches that acted as a second line of defence and as a protection from any flanking attacks.
And mounted on the earthworks, and in particular on those redoubts, were 60 to 75 artillery guns, including modern Krupp's weapons from Germany.
And manning the defensive embankment were some 20,000 Egyptian soldiers, immaculately dressed in white tunics and trousers and red tabush hats, often called fezzes. They were all armed with single-shot Remington rifles.
This was no army of Zulus or Ashanti. This was effectively a modern army the British were facing. Many of the Egyptian officers had even received training in European warfare tactics at French military academies in the past. And this Egyptian army outnumbered the advancing British almost 2 to 1.
Wolseley's army consisted of about 11,000 infantry, 2,000 cavalry and 60 guns. Whilst the Indian Army units had already adopted drab or grey uniforms, most of the British regulars would still wear their famous red coats into this battle, although the Royal Marine Light Infantry, the Royal Artillery and the Horse Guards would wear their famous blue tunics instead. Surveying the Egyptian defences, Wolseley quickly concluded that the flat plain over which the British would have to advance against those 20,000 Remington rifles and Krupp's guns could become a killing ground. But he did observe one chink in the Egyptians' armour. He noticed that despite having built some forward picket fortifications ahead of their lines, the Egyptians did not man them overnight. So General Wolseley decided to advance on the massive Egyptian fortifications under the cover of darkness to get as close as possible and then launch a full bayonet charge at dawn. This was a highly risky strategy. Advances in the dark have a history of going horribly wrong, as those of you who've watched my videos about Spienkop and Stormberg in the Boer War will know only too well. Nevertheless, as night fell on the 12th of September 1882, the British soldiers were each quietly issued with 100 rounds of ammunition and 2 days' worth of rations. And then at 8 p.m, they silently moved forward in a long, extended line. On the British left, closest to the railway, were the Highland Brigade, under General Archibald Allison. At the railway end of that advance were the Highland Light Infantry. Next to them were the Cameron Highlanders, then the Gordon Highlanders, and finally on their right were the famous Black Watch. Behind them in support silently moved the King's Royal Rifles and the Duke of Cornwall's Light Infantry. Between the Highland Brigade and the British right wing, Wolseley placed his Royal Artillery guns. And over on the right, the 2nd Brigade under Major General Graham, consisting of the Royal Irish Fusiliers, the York and Lancaster Regiment, the Royal Marines Light Infantry in their blue tunics, and finally out on the far right were the Royal Irish Regiment. And behind them came the Grenadier, the Scots and the Coldstream Guards under the command of Queen Victoria's son, Arthur, Duke of Connaught. Silently, in the black night, Wolsey's army moved inexorably towards the menacing Egyptian rampart, guided by a Royal Naval officer, Lieutenant Rawson, who was navigating by the stars. It's a testament to Rawson's skills of nighttime navigation and the discipline and professionalism of the British regiments that they not only kept in formation, but they moved so silently that they didn't alert the enemy. The Highland Brigade were about 150 yards short of the embankment when, at around 5 a.m, just as the first rays of sunshine edged over the eastern horizon back towards the Suez Canal, that the Egyptian sentries up on the rampart finally saw the whole British army bearing down on them. Alarm shots rang out and bugles pierced the silence, calling the Egyptians to defend their positions. Immediately, those bugle calls were met by the swirl of the bagpipes and a primeval roar as the Highland Brigade charged. With less distance to cover, it was the Highland Brigade who reached the earthwork defences first. The first troops, clambering to the top, paused to lend a hand to their comrades following up that slippery sand and gravel incline behind them. The first man from the Gordon Highlanders to reach the top of the embankment was Lieutenant Brooks, who was instantly killed by 4 Egyptian gunshots. The first man from the Cameron Highlanders, the aptly named Private Cameron, was likewise shot through the head as he got to the top of the ramparts. 27-year-old Lieutenant William Mordaunt Marsh Edwards, an officer in the Highland Light Infantry, although actually from the county of Norfolk in England, scrambled up the embankment and leapt into a gun pit, killing the Egyptian officer in charge of the gun. Surrounded by the gun crew, he held them off until his men joined him. He was awarded the Victoria Cross for his actions at this battle. The men of the Black Watch were held for 25 minutes by the Egyptian defenders of a 5-gun redoubt, unable to climb up the 14-foot, almost sheer embankment to tackle them. Eventually, a sergeant used his bayonet to start cutting steps into the steep slope, and other men followed suit. And eventually, with the arrival of the King's Royal Rifles behind them, they were able to overwhelm the men in the redoubt. As you can probably tell, whilst the Highland Brigade had taken the defenders by surprise, those units facing them, who were actually from Sudan rather than Egypt, were fighting back. Over on the right, the 2nd Brigade had fallen behind in the initial advance, so when the Egyptian sentries had raised the alarm, they were still nearly half a mile from the embankment, and they were now forced to advance over open country 10 to 15 minutes in a hail of Remington and Krupp's fire. Eventually, when they did reach the enemy, Lieutenant Wilbraham of the Royal Irish Regiment dropped over the top of the rampart, straight on top of 2 surprised Egyptian soldiers. Using his revolver, he took on 2 more defenders before drawing his sword to take on yet another. Finally, another Egyptian soldier clubbed him to the ground with his rifle butt, but before he could finish off Wilbraham, he himself was bayoneted by an Irish soldier by the name of Kelly. With the British now on top of the ramparts, their artillery rushed forward to provide support. Guns were manhandled up those steep slopes and then turned on the Egyptian defenders. Number 2 Battery of the Royal Artillery broke a wheel on their gun in the process of that advance and subsequently earned the nickname the Broken Wheel Battery.
The Egyptian defenders were being forced back, but they still kept fighting, and afterwards Sir Archibald Allison, the commander of the Highland Brigade, praised their bravery, especially as many of their officers seemed to have fled the action.
It was now time for the next phase of Wolsey's plan. At around 4:40 in the morning, the cavalry under Major General Drury Lowe had trotted out to the far right of the British line, moving to outflank the Egyptian defences. And now they turned left, and led by the Bengal cavalry, the Royal Dragoon Guards and the Household Cavalry cut through the Egyptian lines. Panic started to ensue amongst the Egyptian army. The final part of Wolsey's meticulous plan was now sprung. General Macpherson's Indian Division, which actually included the 1st Seaforth Highlanders, another Scottish regiment, had been positioned on the British left flank, on the other side of the railway and canal, and it now moved forward to capture the village of Tel El Kebir itself. With the cavalry charged from one side, together with the artillery and infantry firing from their front, and now in danger of being surrounded from the left, the Egyptians broke, and the battle swiftly turned into a rout. Many Egyptians fled westwards into the desert, whilst others desperately raced to the station to try and board trains heading back towards Cairo.
Despite Royal Artillery shelling, 2 trains did actually manage to get away, but a third was derailed, ending that escape route for the fleeing Egyptians.
The Battle of Tel El Kebir lasted just over an hour. 57 British soldiers were killed, 300 wounded, and 22 reported missing. The Royal Marines had taken the most casualties, 86, whilst the Royal Irish Fusiliers had taken another 39 casualties. However, it was an emphatic victory. It was reported that the British actually lost more men to heatstroke that day than to enemy bullets. Estimates from the bodies lying around in the sun were that the Egyptians had lost something like 1,500 men killed, and countless hundreds of more must have been injured. 58 of their guns had also been captured. The Battle of Tel El Kebir was a decisive victory for the British Army under Wolseley. It was also a decisive defeat for Arabi Pasha and his Egyptian army. The following day, the British entered Cairo without a shot being fired, and Ahmed Urabi surrendered. Less than 2 weeks later, on the 25th of September, the Khedive was restored to his throne in the capital. And later that year, he put Urabi on trial for rebellion. Finding him guilty, he sentenced him to death, but with the agreement from the British, this was commuted to exile in the British colony of Ceylon, now Sri Lanka. He was to remain in exile on the island until 1901, when the Khedive's successor allowed him to return to Egypt for the last 10 years of his life. With the British army stationed in Egypt, the Khedive was in a strange position. Nominally still actually a vassal of the Ottoman Empire, but with the British army stationed in his country and the British High Commissioner essentially calling the shots. The defeat of the Egyptians by the British hastened the revolt against Egyptian rule in the Sudan, led by the Mahdi. And it was in response to this revolt that the Khedive employed Charles Gordon to proceed to Khartoum. By effectively taking over Egypt, the British had taken over Egypt's problems in the Sudan too, which would result in Wolseley leading the unsuccessful effort to relieve Gordon, and later the reconquest of Sudan under Kitchener.
In 1914, at the outbreak of the First World War, Britain declared Egypt a protectorate, before in the 1920s granting the country independence. Well, an independence that was hamstrung by British and indeed French control of the Suez Canal.
Egypt remained strategically important to Britain during both the First and Second World Wars, and her military influence in the country only ended with the Suez Crisis in 1956. The Battle of Tel El Kebir was arguably the crowning glory of Wolseley's illustrious military career, and the British Army's victory there was in no small part down to his meticulous planning. Back in London before his departure to Egypt, he had confidently predicted that he would defeat Urabi Pasha in September, just like he did. He also predicted exactly where he would achieve this victory, pointing to a tiny settlement on the map, 65 miles northeast of Cairo. The settlement was called Tel El Kebir.
Thanks for watching, and I hope you enjoyed that video and found the story interesting. Don't forget to give me a like, and how about joining my History Chap supporters club? What's that all about? Well, click on the link that's going to appear in a moment. Loads more videos coming your way, but in the meantime, keep well, and I'll see you very soon.